I have been talking about DNA methylation in recent videos. DNA methylation is a mechanism in a broader category known as epigenetics. And epigenetics gives the cell the capability of adapting rapidly to environmental threats. In this video, I'm going to explain why epigenetics is the very antithesis of evolution. We begin with Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, an accomplished French scientist in the 18th century. These are just a few of Lamarck's accomplishments. In 1809, when Charles Darwin was born, and 50 years before Darwin published his theory on evolution, Lamarck was publishing his own theory of evolution. Lamarck is best remembered for the idea of the inheritance of acquired characters. What does that mean? If you lift weights, then your children will have bigger muscles because you lifted weights. The inheritance of acquired characters, what you acquire in your lifetime prior to having children, will tend to be passed on to your children. Consider giraffes. Why do giraffes have such a long neck? Well, according to Lamarck, according to this idea, the giraffes are stretching. They're stretching for the higher leaves up in the tree, exercising their necks, stretching their necks, and then the next generation has a slightly longer neck. Now, this is in contrast to Darwin's theory, which said this is all random. Giraffes have longer necks because ancestors just happened to have a longer neck, and that succeeded. That worked better for them. They had more children, more progeny. That longer neck was better represented in later generations. Random change, random biological variation plus natural selection. So we have this contrast between Darwin and Lamarck. Publicly, Darwin acknowledged Lamarck, but privately he scathingly criticized him. In a letter, Darwin wrote, Lamarck's theory was veritable rubbish. So we have Lamarck set up in opposition to Darwin. This paper explains that since the end of the 19th century, Lamarck's name has been firmly linked with this idea of the inheritance of acquired characters. So we have these two ideas in opposition, the inheritance of acquired characters versus chance and natural selection. Now, this actually is not very fair to Lamarck because Lamarck's theory of evolution was much greater than the inheritance of acquired characters. Yes, that was an important part of his theory. He needed that, but his theory was much, much more than that. You know, I once gave an hour-long briefing, and the questions, the discussion, the debate that ensued was all about a point that I thought was uncontroversial. The points that I thought would cause discussion were more or less ignored. Well, that's what happened to Lamarck. He had a much bigger theory, but it was this inheritance of acquired characters, which in fact wasn't even his idea to begin with. He was simply using it in his theory. Yes, it was an important component, but he had much, much more to say. But that's what he's remembered for. Whether that's fair or not, that's what he's remembered for. So according to evolutionists, it's Lamarck versus Darwin. If chance plus natural selection is true, that is, if evolution is true, then the inheritance of acquired characters is false. That's the logic. Now, here's a Wikipedia entry from 2009 talking about Lamarck and Lamarckism. And it explains, Lamarckism is the once popular idea, but since mainly discredited idea, that an organism can pass on characteristics that it acquired during its lifetime to its offspring. Okay, that's 2009. Now that's false. We'll see this a little bit later. This is a false statement. Now a few years later, in 2017, Wikipedia continues this line of criticism. Here they're citing several evolutionists saying that Lamarckism is false. George Simpson, a famous evolutionist, they quote, writing, "The inheritance of acquired characters failed to meet the tests of observation and has been almost universally discarded by biologists." Peter Medawar wrote, "Very few professional biologists believe that anything of the kind occurs or can occur, but the notion persists for a variety of non-scientific reasons." Now, that's hypocritical, as we will see. It's the non-scientific reasoning is on the evolution side. Martin Gardner wrote, "A host of experiments have been designed to test Lamarckianism. All that have been verified have proved negative. On the other hand, tens of thousands of experiments reported in the journals and carefully checked and rechecked by geneticists throughout the world have established the correctness of the gene mutation theory beyond all reasonable doubt. And finally, historian and evolutionist Peter Bowler wrote that although many early scientists took Lamarckism seriously, it was discredited by genetics in the early 20th century. Again, this is all false, as we will see. But again, Lamarck and Darwin are set up in opposition to each other, or the inheritance of acquired characters is set up in opposition to chance and natural selection. But why? Why is inheritance of acquired characters so important? And why is Lamarck primarily remembered for that? After all, as we noted, really not fair to Lamarck. Well, to understand this, we need to step back and look at teleology, a fundamental concept in origins and outside of origins. Now, more than 2,000 years ago, the great Greek philosopher Aristotle, perhaps the greatest philosopher ever, was comfortable with teleology. Teleology is this idea that things in the natural world have a purpose, have a goal, an objective, or what philosophers refer to as a final cause. He would be comfortable with this statement that teeth are for chewing food. When you see this infinitive form of the verb, it indicates a goal or a purpose. For chewing. Teeth are for chewing. This is their purpose. Aristotle was comfortable with this concept of teleology. Well, it's a bit of common sense, right? Well, not according to the Epicureans. They were against this concept of teleology. They said that teeth are not for chewing, but rather teeth formed by chance, and because they could chew, they persisted. You see the flipping around of the logic here. Now, why would they say that? It seems kind of odd, right? Well, the idea behind this is that God would not and must not have designed the particulars, the details of the world. God must not have designed or created the details of the world. And why? Because of the problems in the world, the inefficiencies, the ugliness, the lack of aesthetics, the evil. Lucretius, another Epicurean, in his epic poem De Rerum Natura, explained this, and here's a quote, that in no wise the nature of all things was for us fashioned by a power divine. So great the faults it stands encumbered with. This is the key, the faults. This is what's driving, this is the underlying reasoning, the faults, the problems, the inefficiencies. If you say that God designed the teeth in order to chew things, you must also say that God is responsible for the toothaches and for all the other details of the world that we don't like. If we need to get God away from the details of the world, then we must say that the world arose by itself. Now Lucretius concludes here, quote, "For nothing has been engendered in our body in order that we might be able to use it. It is the fact of its being engendered that creates its use." So the logic, again, is flipped around here. This is anti-teleology. It is opposed to teleology. Now fast forward a few thousand years to 1859, Darwin publishes his book on evolution, The Origin of Species, which is full of this anti-teleological reasoning. Darwin finds problem after problem in the biological world and concludes that the species must have arisen by chance because of all these problems. Darwin was an anti-teleologist. Evolutionist John Rice has written, "There is no way to understand the rise of evolutionary theory in the Enlightenment except in the context of an anti-teleology derived directly from Lucretius." Rice draws that line and makes that link correctly. Now, Darwin supporter Thomas Huxley very succinctly summarized all this. I'm going to show you this quote here, but before I read Huxley, let's just again read the Lucretius conclusion. "For nothing has been engendered in our body in order that we might be able to use it. It is the fact of its being engendered that creates its use." Now let's read Huxley, 1871. "For the teleologist, an organism exists because it was made for the conditions in which it was found. For the Darwinian, an organism exists because out of the many of its kind, it is the only one which has been able to persist in the conditions in which it is found. Far from imagining that cats exist in order to catch mice well, Darwinism supposes that cats exist because they catch mice well. mousing being not the end, but the condition of their existence. And I really like the way Huxley so succinctly and summarized this teleology versus anti-teleology. And that's what we have here, teleology versus anti-teleology, or design versus chance, or the inheritance of acquired characters versus chance and natural selection, or Lamarck versus Darwin. And here's a paper that explains that this is what Lamarck is remembered for. For most biologists and the general public, a Lamarckian is someone who believes in, quote, the inheritance of acquired characters. Now let's look at August Weizmann. Weizmann came a generation or so after Darwin, a late 19th century German thinker who very much agreed with Darwin and disagreed with Lamarck, and he nicely clarified the distinction between the two. There is Weizmann, and if you look at the bottom of this chart, Weizmann made this distinction, this model between the germ cells and the somatic cells. So in a multicellular organism, the germ cells, that would be the sperm and the egg, get together, form the zygote. The zygote divides and forms the rest of the growing body. Those are the somatic cells. And you see the arrow goes one way from the germ cells to the somatic cells. In other words, the information flows only one way from the sperm and the egg. That information flows into the somatic cells, the rest of the body. It doesn't go in the other direction. And that was very important. That's called the Weizmann barrier. It does not, there's no reverse arrow there. And if you look at the quote here, this rules out the inheritance of acquired characteristics proposed by Lamarck. You see, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, like the weightlifter, you lift weights, that's your somatic cells, your muscle cells, acquiring more muscle mass. That information has to make its way back to the germ cells in order for Lamarck, in order for the inheritance of acquired characteristics to be true. You have to have that reverse arrow. Weizmann declared that impossible, not going to happen. That is the Weizmann barrier. Very important. Weizmann nicely made that distinction and laid out that logic that was fundamental to evolutionary theory. Now, why is that so important? If you look at this 1904 quote from Weizmann, and especially the last sentence here, Weizmann explains that if we have this backward arrow, if we allow for the inheritance of acquired characteristics, then that's tantamount to calling upon a supernatural intrusive force on the part of the Creator. So Weizmann, it was important for Weizmann and the evolutionists in general that God not be creating the details of the world. Remember? Straight out of the Lucretius and the Epicureans. God must not be creating the details, not intending for, designing, or creating the details of the world. God is standing off. He's off a ways. He's not in the details of the world. And Weizmann makes this clear. If we allow for Lamarckianism, if we allow for the inheritance of acquired characteristics, if we allow for this backwards arrow here, if the Weizmann barrier doesn't prevail, then we're opening up the door to this supernatural intrusive force on the part of the Creator, and that is not going to work. You see how important religion is in evolutionary thought. It runs all through evolutionary thought. Now, fast forward to the modern synthesis, about 50 years later or so, when modern genetics was combined with Darwinism, you have the modern synthesis, and the modern synthesis also explicitly rejects the possibility of inheritance of acquired characteristics. This is an important fundamental tenet of evolutionary thought. Lamarck must be wrong. The inheritance of acquired characteristics must be wrong. So you have this sort of logic set up here. It's Lamarck versus Darwin, and if chance and natural selection, that is evolution, is true, then the inheritance of acquired characteristics must be false. And of course, evolutionists did insist and do insist that evolution is true. So for them, it's not an if, it is evolution is true, and Lamarck and the inheritance of acquired characters is false. So you have this teleology versus anti-teleology set up against each other, design versus chance, the inheritance of acquired characteristics versus chance and natural selection, Lamarck against Darwin. teleology versus anti-teleology. Okay, so with that as background, what about DNA methylation? This video, after all, is about DNA methylation. How does that tie in? What does DNA methylation have to do with all these lofty ideas? So in the past few videos, we saw that DNA methylation influences gene expression. You can think of this, now remember, DNA methylation are these small organic molecules attached to the DNA and attached to the histone proteins about which the DNA is wrapped. So these DNA methylation patterns, this sprinkling of small molecules onto the DNA, you can think of as turning genes on and off or open and closed. They influence which genes are used, which genes are expressed. Now, gene expression, in turn, influences adaptation. So, you connect those two together. DNA methylation influences adaptation. You have a challenging environment, something shifts, there's a climate change, there's a food source change, something is changing in the environment. The organism, the individual is going to react, is going to adapt. DNA methylation is one of the important mechanisms for that adaptation that causes that adaptation. But we also saw that DNA methylation is inherited. The DNA methylation patterns your body creates can be passed to your children. They can be passed from the somatic cells back to the germ cells. Notice that this arrow now is both ways, a two-headed arrow. The information can flow back from the somatic cells to the germ cells. This is going to be very important. Now, a little terminology here. DNA methylation falls under the broader category of epigenetics. DNA methylation is a mechanism of epigenetics, a chief mechanism of epigenetics. What is epigenetics? Epi meaning above, on top of, genetics. So with genetics, you have the nucleotide sequence of the DNA, the A, T, G, and C nucleotides assembled in some order. Epigenetics are the small organic molecules that are attached to those nucleotides and the histones about which they are wrapped, as we saw in the earlier videos. So you have the methyl groups, acetyl groups, hydroxyl groups, different small organic molecules attached to some of the nucleotides here and there, and sometimes to the histone molecules, the histone proteins about which the DNA is wrapped. That all is part of this epigenetics. So DNA methylation is a mechanism of epigenetics. Epigenetics is a cause of what? The inheritance of acquired characteristics. The arrow goes backwards as well. Very important here. Science has contradicted what? The Weizmann barrier. The Weizmann barrier is unequivocally false. So back to this formulation, Lamarck versus Darwin, if chance and natural selection, that is evolution, is true, then the inheritance of acquired characters is false. Wait a minute, we have a problem here. We'll come back to this. But we're seeing that the science contradicts the theory. Now, let's look at this quote here, back to this quote, reading a little further. Since the end of the 19th century, Lamarck's name has been firmly linked with the idea of the inheritance of acquired characters. More recently, epigenetic inheritance has been represented as a form of the transmission of acquired characters, and thus is a confirmation, at least of a sort, of Lamarck's most famous idea. Aha, indeed. This is going to cause problems, as we see here. Quote, finally, a burgeoning set of studies have resurrected the once heretical idea that ancestral environments can affect future generations. The environment influences the somatic cells, and that information is passed back to the germ cells, influencing future generations. The environment is directing things. Uh-oh. And so you have books like this where Lamarck is featured prominently alongside Darwin, Epigenetic Inheritance and Evolution. Lamarck, in fact, is a keyword now. Lamarck is used constructively as a keyword. These data show that epigenetic inheritance is what? Ubiquitous. Look at the title here, Transgenerational Epigenetic Inheritance. What is that? Transgenerational, very important word here, transgenerational, epigenetic inheritance. The epigenetic signals, such as the DNA methylation patterns, are being passed on to the next generation. Transgenerational. When you see that word transgenerational, you know this is a violation of the Weizmann barrier, a falsification of the Weizmann barrier. Transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. This is what the science is showing. Michael Skinner writes, much as Lamarck suggested, changes in the environment literally alter our biology and is transmitted from one generation to the next. And then you have books like this, Transformations of Lamarckism, talking about Lamarck's ideas constructively. There are many journal papers now on this sort of thing. Look at these. Transgenerational inheritance of environmentally induced epigenetic alterations. Epigenetic transgenerational inheritance. Potential roles of non-coding RNAs in environmental epigenetic transgenerational inheritance. Epigenetic transgenerational inheritance of altered sperm histone retention sites. Functions and mechanisms of epigenetic inheritance in animals. Transgenerational inheritance. Again and again we see this now. This is the science contradicting the theory. But epigenetics is still considered heretical by evolutionists. In this David Haig paper we've been looking at, Haig writes, the challenge to neo-Darwinism comes not from the existence of epigenetic inheritance, but from the possibility that these epimutations are directed rather than random. In other words, the environment is influencing these epimutations to help creatures, to help the individuals adapt. You see how metaphysically laden the science is here. They cannot allow for this. This is heretical. Now here's an article about blind cavefish. These cavefish have lost their eyes. They can't see. Well, they live in a dark environment. They don't need to see. Evolutionists have always said that they've lost their eyes by the evolutionary process, random mutations and natural selection. But this article is about new findings that these cavefish have lost their eyes by epigenetic changes. The epigenetic adaptations have removed these eyes. Instead, the genes have been switched off by the addition of chemical tags called methyl groups. This is what is known as an epigenetic rather than genetic change. Skipping down, epigenetic processes can play an equally important role in adaptive evolution. Very interesting. It shows we don't need evolution to explain this, but they interview an evolutionist who is suspicious of all this. He just can't shake off the anti-teleology, the religion behind this. He views everything through this lens. See, here he says he's concerned that people are trying to sneak religious ideas back into evolutionary theory. Oh, how hypocritical that is, how ironic. And then, quote, they are trying to allow organisms to have agency, not controlled by genes. This teleology must not be allowed, or what he perceives as teleology must not be allowed. So this is causing a problem, a struggle for evolutionists. On the one hand, they have their dogma, their anti-teleology, their religion. On the other hand, the science is contradicting their theory. Here's a paper that says, in recent years, the belief that the DNA sequence is the sole basis for biological inheritance has been challenged by the epigenetics, the discovery of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. This is going to cause a problem. And back to the Haig paper, he writes, I will therefore commit heresy and concede that there is a sense in which epigenetics allows the inheritance of acquired characters, and that the characters thus inherited can increase the adaptedness of an organism to its environment. You see, this is heresy for the evolutionists. They're really struggling with this. This is a big deal. Now, there are many people who have observed this. One of them is Dennis Noble. He writes that Lamarck and Lamarckian ideas were not only ignored, but actively ridiculed during the second half of the 20th century. Garland Allen writes much the same sentiment here. Lamarck has been ignored, misrepresented, and stereotyped. Now here's an article about a scientist who is meeting up with this sort of resistance from evolutionists as he researches Lamarckian-type ideas. He states that when most biologists hear the name Lamarck, the reaction is, "Oh my, here we go again." Continuing, the really heretical thing to say is that the environment could be pushing the epigenetic information in a direction that is beneficial. That raises the hackles. You see the great, tremendous struggle and problem that evolutionists are having with this. The science is contradicting their dogma. As this paper explains, according to Lamarck, organisms adapt by developing new variations in response to changing environments, and these new adaptive traits become heritable. Because of the apparent teleological nature of the theory, Lamarck was considered for 200 years to be completely wrong. Evolutionary thought is entirely metaphysical. They're driven by this dogma. So what are evolutionists going to do? Well, recently they have been attempting to integrate epigenetics into evolution. Here's a paper, Epigenetics and Evolution, not or evolution, and evolution. They write, a key question is how epigenetic patterns transmit between generations and impact what? Evolutionary dynamics. They're going to try to integrate epigenetics with evolution. Skipping down, in this article, we discuss recent studies examining different aspects of epigenetics as they pertain to evolutionary processes. As they pertain, they're going to try and integrate epigenetics and evolution. Here's a paper entitled Quantitative Epigenetics and Evolution. The integration of epigenetics into evolutionary thinking is still gathering momentum. Skipping down here, epigenetics should be incorporated into evolutionary theory. Now, as an aside, take a look at this second quote here. Organisms may use the additional variation afforded by epigenetic mechanisms as a bet hedging strategy in unknown environments. Now, I hope a red flag goes up for you here. I've talked about this sort of thing in many of my previous videos. This is teleological language. And here's the irony, here's the hypocrisy. The evolutionary literature is full of teleological language. Evolutionists cannot even do their research without using teleological ideas and teleological language. It pervades the literature. Here you have an obvious example, organisms using a bet hedging strategy. If you go strictly by evolutionary theory, organisms don't use strategies. Using a bet hedging strategy indicates a larger awareness and the presence of goals or objectives. This is a major internal contradiction in evolutionary thought, the use of teleological concepts and language. It appears over and over again. Okay, here's another paper, Evolution, Epigenetics, and Cooperation. Integrating epigenetic studies with older evolutionary theories has drawn attention to the ways in which what? Evolution occurs. They're going to try and integrate epigenetics with evolution. And again, a paper entitled, How Does Epigenetics Influence the Course of what? Evolution. They are going to try and integrate epigenetics with evolution. And this editorial, Evolutionary Consequences of Epigenetic Inheritance. They're going to try and integrate these together. Quote, the focus of this special issue is broadly on the evolutionary forces, what? Selecting for epigenetic inheritance. Here you get a hint of how they're going to do this. Evolutionary forces selecting for epigenetic inheritance. In other words, evolution is going to create these epigenetic mechanisms. Back to the Hague paper, he explains this, quote, a conventional neo-Darwinist interpretation would view these epigenetic mechanisms as switches evolved by natural selection to enable genes to exhibit conditional behavior. I want to point out a couple of things. First, here you have this idea of evolution creating the epigenetic mechanisms. Epigenetics becomes a product, a result of evolution. Secondly, again, I hope a red flag went up for you. I hope that two red flags went up for you, because here we have two infinitive forms. Whenever you see the infinitive form, check it out. Here you have to enable, and to exhibit, a twofer. In one sentence, Hague gives us two infinitive forms which always are a tip-off of teleological language, of goals, properties, objectives, final causes. Natural selection wants to enable genes to exhibit conditional behavior, a massive internal contradiction in evolutionary thought. Skipping down here, quote, how else could their purposefulness have originated except by natural selection of random mutations? He's talking about epigenetics, the epigenetic mechanisms. He's telling you that they evolved. They are a product, a result of evolution, of natural selection and random mutations. You had random mutations somehow creating these epigenetic mechanisms, and then natural selection preserving them. Skipping down, there is no reason in principle why a system for the inheritance of acquired characters cannot evolve by natural selection, given a strong enough selective advantage and appropriate genetic variation. He's claiming there's no reason why epigenetics could not have been created by evolution, by the evolutionary process. The problem here is that there is no selection. His caveat was that there must be sufficiently strong selection. Not only is there no strong selection, there's no selection at all. The problem is that epigenetic mechanisms respond to future environmental challenges. Let's repeat that. Epigenetic mechanisms respond to future environmental challenges. They have no current value. There is no fitness increase, to put it in evolutionary terminology, even if somehow they could have arisen by random mutations, which itself is astronomically unlikely to the point of being absurd. This is not science at all. Epigenetic mechanisms are not going to evolve. It's not going to happen. It's against the science. So this is the sequence if you're an evolutionist. First, blind mutations must somehow create DNA methylation, the mechanisms of DNA methylation, and the other mechanisms of epigenetics. Now this is just astronomically unlikely. The entropic barrier here is just silly. This is not going to happen, but somehow it must happen. 2, these mechanisms just happen to protect the individual against future environmental threats, unknown future environmental threats, a whole array of possible environmental challenges. 3, even though not selected for, because there's no fitness value, because those environmental threats are in the future, these mechanisms somehow just happen to persist. 4, when a particular environmental threat emerges, the population is then protected. All is well. And then on top of all that, 5, this must be inheritable. Those DNA methylation patterns are somehow imprinted back, transmitted back, propagated back to the germ cells. That is another set of complicated molecular machinery that somehow arises from random mutations. As this paper states, this non-genetic form of inheritance requires epigenetic modifications of the germline, sperm and egg, to transmit an altered epigenome to the early embryo, which can impact the epigenetics and transcriptomes of all subsequent derived somatic cells. Yes, that is required. Blind mutations somehow created all that. And so we see that the inheritance of acquired characters has passed through the truth cycle. This is my term for what many people have observed. Truth seems to pass through these 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. We've seen all of that with the inheritance of acquired characters in evolutionary thought. In their attempt to integrate evolution and epigenetics, evolutionists have simply mass forgotten the previous century. You cannot criticize, reject, delegitimize, and denigrate an opposing theory and state that it must be false, and then upon its confirmation act as though everything is normal. So let's go back to our formulation of Lamarck versus Darwin. If chance and natural selection, that is evolution, is true, then the inheritance of acquired characters is false. But now we can add to this, the inheritance of acquired characters is true. And so by modus tollens, therefore, evolution is false. Let that sink in. The conclusion, the inevitable, the necessary conclusion, according to the evolutionists' own logic, they have judged themselves here, evolution is false. That is a necessary consequence of the evolutionists' own logic, the evolutionists' own claims. Evolution is false. Religion drives science, and it matters.